Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for all joining this NSF Proposal Writing Workshop that we've put together. And so today we're going to get to hear all about NSF proposals, how to write them, and also advice for writing successful NSF proposals. And so we'll be hearing from Dr. Kurt Gurley and Dr. Lori Peake, who both have tremendous experience and knowledge when it comes to writing successful NSF proposals. And so before I turn it over to them, I'd like to go ahead and just briefly introduce them. There we go. Okay. So Dr. Gurley is the Associate Director and Co-Principal Investigator of the NHERI Boundary Layer Wind Tunnel Facility, as well as the Education, Outreach, and Diversity Lead. He is also Professor of Civil and Coastal Engineering at the University of Florida. And Dr. Lori Peake is the Principal Investigator of Converge, the Social Science Extreme Events Research Network, the Interdisciplinary Science and Engineering Extreme Events Research Network. And she is also the Director of the Natural Hazards Center and Professor of Sociology at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And so without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn over the presentation to them. And if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and type them in the chat, and Dr. Gurley and Dr. Peake will address them throughout the presentation as those questions come along.
Thank you, Jasmine. I'll start off, and you'll hear from Dr. Peake and I quite a bit. We'll be sort of tag teaming as we go along. Let me start by seeing if I can get myself set up here. I'm going to need to share screen.
Might have to stop share first. Is that how that works?
Maybe, yeah, give that a try.
Okay, we'll see.
And I'm still figuring out how to work two monitors, so we'll get it there. We'll get there eventually. And let's share screen. Hopefully you just see sort of a blank canvas for now, and then you see a presentation. Do you see a full screen presentation?
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, thank you. Never be shy about telling me I don't know technology, because you're probably right. So welcome everybody. Thanks for attending. I know we're recording this, so please feel free to pass along the on-demand to your colleagues. I'm Kurt Gurley, first person on the slide, just because I'm the first person talking. I'm at the University of Florida, and Lori Peake is joining us from University of Colorado Boulder. There's a lot of content in the presentation, and it's come from a lot of different sources. So I'm just acknowledging some of the primary contributors over the years. So I've drawn pieces of information from slide decks that I saw Arendam Chowdhury at FIU present 3 years ago, for example. So rule number one as an academic, make sure you give credit wherever credit is due, whenever possible. So a lot of people went into developing the information here. It's not Lori and I kind of all on our own. We'll start by introducing ourselves a little bit in terms of, you kind of know who I am and where I'm from, but I'll tell you a little bit about my experience with the National Science Foundation and funding, and then Lori's going to follow up and do the same. So I'm a professor in civil and coastal engineering. I'm a fairly traditional research teaching professor, except for my undergraduate degree is in aerospace engineering, and then I went into civil engineering for graduate school. So I've always had an interest in wind, and then it wound up being bluff bodies instead of airplane wings. I've been doing this since 1997, so I guess it's going on 25 years of writing NSF proposals. And I've taken the usual path, meaning I started with a success rate at NSF of maybe 10%, and now my success rate is maybe 70 or 80% because of the things I learn along the way. And I'm going to be sharing with you as much as I can to help you start off at 70 or 80% instead of at 10%. So I'll pass it off to Lori real quick to say hello as well.
Thank you so much to Dr. Kurt Gurley for all of the work and leadership with this, and thank you to Robin and the Graduate Student Council team for inviting us. I was really excited about this. And so, as Kurt said, my name is Lori Peake, and I just wanted to share with you, in addition to titles and roles that you've already heard, that I, like Kurt, have a long history and experience with the National Science Foundation, and I've applied for and received funding from the NSF from their rapid grant mechanism program in the immediate aftermath of disaster. I've received an NSF Eager award. I've received several, both as individual PI as well as in large collaborative team NSF grants as part of both open calls as well as special calls. And also very proudly, I've served as the mentor to 2 graduate students who have received NSF doctoral dissertation improvement grants. And so today we will be focusing on NSF, but I also have a lot of experience with receiving funding from many other federal agencies, as well as nonprofit and philanthropic organizations, as well as state level organizations and some international funders as well. And so again, while this workshop predominantly is going to be focused on NSF, if at any point you have questions for us about these other potential funding outlets, Kurt and I would be so happy to respond to those questions. And the last thing I wanted to say before I turn it back to Kurt was that one of the things that is so beautiful and unique about our field of natural hazards is that disasters literally serve a forcing function where they bring together social scientists, engineers, natural scientists, and people from other disciplines. And so this is a deeply multi as well as interdisciplinary field, as you all know. And what that means is when you submit proposals to most of the NSF directorates that have a hazards or disaster focus, there is a real chance that you could have somebody like me, a sociologist, as well as somebody like Dr. Gurley, an engineer, on your review panel. So as you're thinking about this today, think about how could I tell a story that both would enlighten and enliven Lori as well as Kurt. And if you can do that, you're going to get to that 70 or 80% success rate with funding. Over to you, Kurt. Thank you.
A lot of today is the importance of storytelling to complement or even supersede the technical aspects of what you bring to the table. And I should also pop in and say most of my area is wind hazard engineering. And I also have a small administrative role in the department, and most of my role there is with young faculty development. So I've personally reviewed, dozens, if not hundreds, of NSF proposals over my time from people sort of in your position, their first or second time writing something. All right, so let's first of all bring up some workshop resources, and I think Robin is going to pop that link also into the chat. This is going to get you to a folder that you can access the material that we're presenting now, as well as a few other documents that'll be useful for you. In this presentation, the grant proposal guideline, and I also included a recent successful proposal that I'm a co-author of, along with a colleague at Johns Hopkins. So thanks to Dr. Mike Shields at Johns Hopkins, my colleague on that proposal, he gave permission to share our secret sauce, so to speak. So take advantage of that and ask your own colleagues once you're a faculty member to see good proposals. Lori and I are not confident that we're going to get this done in 60 minutes. So, and we know that people have, constraints on their time. So if you have to drop off, please feel free. It's being recorded. You can go back and pick up on things that you missed. And it's not going to offend us. It is a Friday afternoon after all. So we're just going to go at a pace we think is comfortable for learning. And please don't be worried if it's 4 o'clock Eastern and we're not done yet. That's probably going to happen. As we go, you'll see sections carved out like overview and objectives, where we may transition between speakers, Lori and I, but we're just going to keep the same slide deck alive, so it won't be a big transition. We're going to be trying our best to keep an eye on the chat to see if we can gather questions along the way. And if we don't get to your question during the live interaction, Robin is going to be cataloging and making sure Lori and I get access to those questions, and we'll follow up with you personally if necessary to get your question answered. All right, so we'll start with, who's this for? This is sort of obvious, right? We're talking to mostly graduate students and postdocs considering an academic career where you'd be writing proposals to NSF and other federal agencies. We don't think, we're assuming you have little or no experience leading any sort of grant writing. That's the audience we're speaking to. There's going to be a heavy emphasis on National Science Foundation strategies, whether it's a career award, rapid award, or what's called an open or at-large proposal, which is you have an idea, you submit it whenever. Some of the advice that we're going to give carries over to other federal agencies, and some doesn't necessarily. So understand if you're writing a grant to DARPA, some of the things we say may or may not resonate with the DARPA officials, and we'll try to point out those differences as we go. These are the questions, thank you very much, that were posed in advance by you folks. And I'm going to go through them real quick, and I'll either answer them or say it's going to be answered in the presentation. So how to outline core proposal elements on intellectual merit and broader impact statements. You have examples in that link, and we are going to be speaking a lot about how to structure the proposal to respond to these. What can someone do to make sure their statement is memorable? The most memorable thing you can do is make sure it's understandable to you and me and Dr. Peake and your mom and your high school brother. If they all get in some aspect why you're doing what you're doing and why it's important, you're most of the way there. You are not, and it's going to be emphasized throughout the presentation, you will not win people over by having pages and pages of equations and showing how smart you are. Storytelling wins awards. How do I communicate to my topic to NSF reviewers who are not well versed in my topic? It kind of speaks to what I just said. That is really your goal. Most of the people you're trying to win over to get the funding are not necessarily domain experts. So we speak a lot about that in the presentation. How does someone start learning about budgets to include in proposals? We'll talk about that. There's a few slides on that in here. You should definitely, when you get a job as an academic, talk to your own grants officers, because they'll have a lot of information about how to structure budgets. Does NSF fund a proposal with any equipment required for the project in the proposal, or equipment must be written as a separate proposal? Depends on how much money it costs. There are whole separate categories of NSF funding for very large pieces of instrumentation. They're called MRI awards, major research instrumentation. But I'll give you an example. A project I just got funded with a colleague at Colorado State, not the same proposal that's in the folder. She needed 2 high-speed cameras to do some of the work that we needed to do. They were on the order of 20 grand a piece. We didn't have them, she didn't have them, so they got written in as a budget item in the proposal, and it was explained why we needed them. As a result, the program officer said, do you really need these? Can you get them from someplace else? We had a negotiation, and ultimately the program officer agreed to pay for that equipment as a part of the funded proposal. So sorry, the answer to that is it depends. If it's $200,000-300,000, you're probably not going to fit it into a standard NSF proposal. If it's in the 5-figure range, it probably can go in there. What are some steps someone should follow to take following a rejected proposal? That is going to come towards the end of the presentation today. What happens if you win or lose? Can a rejected proposal be resubmitted? Yes, absolutely. You have a 1-year window, actually not a 1-year window, a 1-year moratorium. From the day you submit your proposal, you can submit a rejected proposal 1 year later. It cannot be exactly the same proposal. It has to be modified based on your panel's suggestions. And it's a good idea to get with your program officer to get sort of tacit permission to resubmit. And I think Lori talks about that towards the end of the proposal as well. Okay. Funding opportunities. This is still me. How many opportunities exist for you? You may not be aware, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the NSF Career Award, which is intended for young investigators. But there's actually, among different federal agencies, more than 15 types of career awards, depending on your area and the agencies you write to. So a lot of the military research agencies and DARPA, National Institutes of Health, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, they all have their own version of the NSF Career Award. So you're not constrained to just do NSF Career. And you can double up. I know many faculty at UF have a career award and a DOE Young Investigator Award. Just can't be on exactly the same thing, right? You can't duplicate. So keep your eyes wide open. A good place to get a good handle on all the different opportunities available, particularly for younger investigators, is this document. It happens to be from Dr. Peake's home university, the University of Colorado. I believe they put these out on an annual basis, Dr. Peake, correct me if I'm wrong. But some universities do a really good job of collating all the opportunities and putting them out. In addition, one more resource, the best resource for learning how to write grants, other than this seminar today, of course, is a book that is soon to be released. Am I correct, Dr. Peake?
That's correct. It's literally in press right now.
So keep an eye out for this, the grant writing guide. There's lots of grant writing guides, but Dr. Peake has reviewed and read many of them, and she swears that this is the best one. So put this on your reading list for sure.
And this one, I have to say, Betty Lai is a renowned disaster researcher. She's a psychologist, but she interviewed people from all different disciplines, walks of life, and this really is for scholars. And so that's right, there are lots of other grant writing guides, but this one is written by a renowned researcher for researchers like you. This book is amazing. It's short, it's to the point. Everything that we're going to touch on today, she elaborates in this book. So there's going to be so much synergy.
Good. Yeah, a lot of homework is going to be involved for you to get good at this. So expect it to be a long process and learn from as many people as you can as you go along. So we're going to do a transition to topics. We've talked a little bit broader. Now we're going to start drilling down about NSF. So Lori's going to step in and start doing the talking.
Perfect. Thank you. And I had put this in the chat, but everybody, that slide transition that you just saw, if you have any questions as we're going along, please do drop them in the chat, and we'll either use the chat to answer them, or we'll pause in the presentation and answer them verbally. And so I'm just going to cover, since NSF is our main focus today, one of the most important things before you ever submit is to know your funder, know their mission, know their vision, know the structure of the funding organization. And so NSF is a large, major funder of research in the United States. There are 7 major directorates, and then many divisions that are housed under every directorate, and then there are programs within those divisions. And to give you a sense of sort of our home base of CMMI, which is within the engineering directorate, it actually includes 27 programs, and each of those programs has or most of those programs have a distinct program officer. And so you want to know your NSF structure, and then understand which division or program might be the best or most obvious fit for you. And because of what I said at the beginning, and you all know that we're very multidisciplinary, sometimes you may be submitting to both SBE, social, behavioral, and economic sciences, and engineering, because there's a history of SBE and engineering co-funding proposals in our field, because social scientists and engineers do work together so often. And so many of you are engineers, of course, look within engineering, but also look outside of engineering, because as disasters have increased in frequency and magnitude, more and more of these programs, divisions are funding hazards and disaster research. Next slide, please. So the next thing is that you want to know your NSF structure, but then you also want to know your NSF program officer. And so literally the job of the program officer, every year at the beginning of the year, they get a budget, and they then need to figure out, how am I going to invest this budget in the best ideas? And so in order to do that, they need to know, who are you? What is your idea? Is this going to fit with my broader portfolio of research that I'm funding? And is this the next big leap forward? And so program officers, part of their job is to put themselves out there, and they do expect to be contacted by you with your ideas, with your one-pagers that we're going to talk about today. And as we say here, your success is their success, quite literally, that when they find a rising star, a great idea, and they fund you, that is a feather in their program cap as well. And so one of the ways that you can get on the radar of a program officer, or even a set of program officers who you think might have synergies and maybe would be interested in funding you based on past things that they've funded, ideas that you've seen they've really supported, is start with a short, to the point email, not an email that takes 10 minutes to read, because nobody's going to read it and you're probably not going to get a response. 5 sentences that is to the point, that lets them know who you are, what you're interested in, and what your ask is. And so if your ask is, I have a question about this program solicitation, may I talk to you on the phone? I have a one-pager in response to the Dear Colleague letter. Would you review it? And so it's very, very clear who you are, why you're writing, and what you're asking for. It's also important, again, because many different programs or divisions might fund similar work. One of the things that I've heard NSF program directors in the hazards and disaster space explicitly request is, let's say that a big hurricane happens and you're gonna try to submit a rapid proposal, and oh, I'm gonna send it to Bob O'Connor in social behavioral economic, I'm gonna send it to Joy Pauschke in engineering, and I'm gonna send it to Jack Mazzaros in engineering as well. They have requested that you send your one pager to all three of them at once rather than 3 separate emails, because then they're not trying to chase people down and to figure out who's heard what. So be clear in your correspondence, be transparent, and be inclusive. Next slide, please. I think, and I know that Kurt agrees on this, the single most important thing you can do to learn about the secret sauce of writing great grants and to become a great grant writer is to get on a review panel. When I was a brand new assistant professor in 2005 at Colorado State University, I got the call from NSF inviting me to be on a review panel. And I don't remember being so scared, so nervous, feeling so overwhelmed. I was by far the most junior person with all these senior, big name, top scholars in the field. And I got into that panel review room and it transformed my life as a scholar, because not only did I get to read like 10 proposals in depth and write reviews of them, and yes, it was a lot of work, but as with a lot of work, you learn a lot, learn so much along the way. And I learned so much from those fellow reviewers and what they were picking up on, what their bones were that they had to pick, what they loved, what elevated proposals, and so forth. And so the way, great question, Mona, that you can become a proposal reviewer is to reach out, send your CV to your program officer and ask them, and volunteer to serve on a panel. There's no guarantee that they're going to say yes or invite you, but they're always looking for panelists. And most program officers I've found are very committed to having diverse panels in terms of early career to more senior faculty members. And so definitely reach out, figure out that program that's most of interest to you, and volunteer to serve on that panel. Next slide, please. And thanks for highlighting that, Kurt. That's fabulous.
Oops, sorry, I got to get my cursor back instead of.
I was like, I love this. And so, and again, that's the best way to write a good proposal. Like we said, let's move from the 10% success to the 70% success. You know what? You are going to win 0% of the grants that you don't submit for. But if you do submit, there's at least some likelihood that you're going to get them. And so what does NSF want? It is a moving target. NSF, like any agency, their priorities shift. Disasters can drive different funding calls and so forth. And so it's a moving target. That's why you have to know the organization, know the funder, get to know your program officer. Don't propose a baby step. NSF is the nation's premier scientific agency, and you will hear program officers say over and over and over again, we don't tell you what we're trying to fund, but we're looking for the next transformative leap. We're not looking for an incremental step. And so try to think about what is that transformative leap. And that's where a one-pager can be really, really effective. And again, reach out to that program officer, develop that relationship with them, ask them questions like, what are you seeing coming down the pipe in terms of what the next big focal area might be? Next slide, please. Right now at the NSF, the 10 big ideas are how they are organizing their funding priorities. And I have to say, when I wrote a $3 million grant proposal that was funded for our NHERI facility, which is Converge, it's the only social science-led facility in the larger Converge network. When I sat down to write that, I had a vision for what it was that I wanted to do with Converge, but I did my homework. I spent a lot of time reading about the foundation's 10 big ideas as their major funding priorities. So it's no accident that Converge is named Converge, that it was a convergence with one of those big ideas around growing convergence research. But in my Converge proposal, I also make connections to NSF Includes, which is about diversity, equity, and inclusion, about data as other priorities. And so again, know that organization, because it's going to help you to write a stronger proposal and to help with your vision and to get the words on the page. Next.
And just I'll chime in really quick. Remember, it's always your job to explain to the reviewers how you fit into the big picture and priorities of NSF. There is no, if you build it, they will come. You have to be specific and lead that horse right to the water's edge and push their lips down to the water. You got to tell them how you fit.
Absolutely. So about collaborations, and Kurt and I both have a lot of experience of joining on proposals when we were early career and maybe being a co-PI before we were ready to become a PI. And so it is great to develop those collaborations. And again, our field is so open, so welcoming, so primed for collaborative work, because I know as a social scientist, engineers reach out to me a lot because they're looking for that social science integration. And so collaborations are a great way to get your toes into the subject where you may not have a record yet, but it's where you're wanting to go. You want to partner with people and complement, but you definitely do not want to duplicate what's already been done. And that's why do your homework is going to be a thread that runs through this presentation for today. Choose your collaborators carefully. This is always a tricky thing because sometimes people kind of reach out at the last minute and you want to go for something because it seems promising, but the science of team science has taught us so much about how important relationships are, knowing one another, taking time to build strong linkages to doing better science. And so choose those collaborators carefully, because sometimes if you got to get on board for a 2-year, a 3-year, a 5-year grant, that's like a marriage that you stepped into, maybe without even knowing your partner. Would you marry somebody without knowing them? No. And some, and so you don't want to enter into a 5-year commitment with somebody if you don't know them. And so ask for others' opinions, their past experiences, and remember that you bring the ideas and you're not looking for help, you're providing an opportunity. And to the question that just came up in the chat, NSF does require annual reports, and that actually, to tie into this theme, it is a great way to check in with how you're doing, the progress you're making, and how your collaborations are going. Next.
The nice thing about NSF funding is if you drift from what you originally thought you were going to be doing and you wrote the proposal, you just explain that in a report. If you drift too far, you have to get with the PO and explain yourself, but you are free to wind up in a different target zone than you thought you would 3 years prior. And that's a nice thing about the flexibility of NSF. They want to encourage the exploratory nature of research. And we're going to transition to another topic, and Dr. Peake's going to keep on talking. Before we do, I think this will get answered next, Dr. Peake, but Hamid asked, is there only one PO in charge of making decisions for a proposal?
That is a great question. And as with all good questions, it depends. Sometimes people do what they put their proposals under collaborative review. And this is always, I've had lots of conversations about, oh, is that a good idea? Because you might get reviewed by 2 panels. So let's say that I put my proposal in to be reviewed by Bob O'Connor in social behavior economic and Joy Pauschke in engineering. So I would actually get 2 panel reviews, and some people go, oh, that doubles your chance of somebody loving it. Other people say, oh, that doubles your chance of somebody hating it. And so there's a lot of debate around whether do you do the dual review, but oftentimes you are working with a single program officer, but sometimes program officers, if they really want to fund you, but there may be budget items, they may go to another program officer. So it's a great question, Hamid, and it really is, and it depends. I think most of the time we think of ourselves as working with a single program officer, but there's a little more of that collaboration than I've learned over the years than I thought there was. So it's a great question. Now I'm going to transition to who's the audience for your proposal. So again, this is about that relationship, asking good questions, listening carefully, taking time to reflect. Your program officer really is your first audience, and the panel is also an audience. But at the end of the day, the panel is going to convene, they're going to rank and rate your proposal, but at the end of the day, the program officer ultimately is going to be the one who's going to make the funding decision. And so that's really important to know. And so there's this really dynamic relationship between the program officer receives, the proposal initially vets the proposal, but then the panel is the one who decides, even if it goes for full review, if it gets the full review and the discussion in the panel, they then make a recommendation to the program manager or officer who ultimately makes the decision. And I think it's pretty rare for like a panel to completely reject a proposal and the program manager to then go, no, 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 I'm going to fund it. But it doesn't mean it doesn't ever happen, or vice versa, that a panel may absolutely love the proposal and then the program officer doesn't fund it because maybe they don't have funding or it doesn't fit in their portfolio or what have you. So it's a complicated and a dynamic relationship, but definitely the program officer and the panelists, they really are your prime audience.
Yeah, this slide is meant to convey, ultimately, you should be thinking as a writer of a proposal to NSF that you need to convince the panel and expect the PO is going to do their job and follow the panelists' recommendations. It doesn't always go exactly that way, word for word, line by line, but this is your audience, is a panel. And if you were writing to DARPA, for example, they don't even have a panel.
Right.
The program manager makes all the decisions. So the way you write the proposal and your audience changes entirely. That's why we said the answer to who your audience is depends on what agency you're writing to. But if it's NSF, you're convincing a panel of people, some of whom are experts on your field, some of whom are not. And that's the next slide. Before we do, Hamid had another question. Does the rank of the university where the proposal is submitted to NSF impact the officer's decision? I have a couple of thoughts on this. It does not impact it in terms of if the quality of the proposal stands out. They don't really care if you come from a university nobody's heard of, as long as they're eligible to receive NSF funding. And in some ways, it might wind up being an advantage because the NSF does want geographic diversity on where their money goes. They can't just give all their money to MIT and Caltech, right? So if you're a great researcher and you're in University of Nevada, Reno, which is not a bad place, but not many of you have maybe even heard of it, you're likely to get funding there as well, as long as your idea sticks. Dr. Peake, do you have thoughts on that question?
Absolutely. And it's a great question. And in the proposals, there's a facilities and equipment statement where you have to verify essentially that your institution is equipped to be able to support the kind of research that you've proposed. And Dr. Gurley's absolutely right that over time, as there's been more focus on justice, equity, and inclusion, there have been those questions about who are we funding? Are we having geographic and institutional diversity, which I think is great. And again, allows for collaborations aren't just between researchers, they're also between institutions. And that's where it's fabulous. Sometimes historically, Black colleges and universities, other minority serving institutions, they are oftentimes leading proposals or may end up in these incredible collaborative spaces. And there's a lot of attention to this right now, rightfully so. And so I think thinking about collaborations at the individual, the team, and the institutional level is crucial to advance our science in an equitable way. And I definitely agree, Hamid, in response to your question and Dr. Gurley's answer about the panel as your audience. And so who's on your panel? A typical panel does consist of about 10 reviewers, but it's important to note that because there may be around 20 proposals, if you end up on a panel review, you're not going to be reviewing every single one of those proposals because this is basically volunteer service. They pay for your travel, but basically you're doing this on your own time. And so they're not going to make you review 25 proposals in 1 month. Instead, they divvy up the proposals based on expertise and so forth. And so you'll get about 4 to 5 panelists, and the broader panel will review your proposal, and at least one of them will be a domain expert. But like we said at the beginning, you're also going to have plenty of people who may come from entirely different disciplines, backgrounds, etc., than you. And so that's why it's important. Spell out every acronym upon its first use, root out jargon ruthlessly, write in clear, direct sentences, write as if really you have to be writing to a broad, educated, informed audience, but the story you're telling, that should be able to touch hearts and minds of people across every segment, age group, etc. And so once somebody starts going, I don't know what that means, I'm confused, you lost me, you're probably not going to get funded. And so that's why it's also important, leave plenty of time to get your proposal reviewed by others who are outside of your field. If you do think you're going to be reviewed by a more multidisciplinary panel, because that's where people from outside of your discipline can really help catch these issues. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we're about, if you thought we were talking fast so far, we're about to turn on the fire hose and point it at your face. So get ready. We had so much material, Dr. Peake and I had a really hard time paring things down. So we just didn't pare it down. So here you go. So writing your proposal, first start with what to pursue as an academic, as an early career researcher. You want to stay connected to your PhD and postdoc work, but you need to find a new wrinkle. And a new wrinkle, I don't mean a tiny little bubble. I need something that's very interesting and new, but is related, because you need a publication record with some expertise and experience on your topic, unless you're doing a collaborative proposal where, like, for example, the researcher at Johns Hopkins and I working, he never had done anything in wind engineering, and now he's got a proposal using our wind tunnel because he collaborated with me. So we complemented each other. But if I was going alone on a proposal, I have to make sure that I can say I've published in peer-reviewed literature on the subject. So that's why you have to stay connected. You have to avoid incremental steps on what you're already doing. We've said that before. Several things are going to be repeated many times throughout the presentation. That's not an accident. All right. What if you're thinking about what would be the next chapter in the dissertation I'm currently writing? No, not good enough. You need to think about what would be a good follow-up entire dissertation based on what I've already learned. That's the topic of your first NSF proposal, whether it's career or at large. That's the step they want you to take. Don't collaborate with your research advisor right out of the gate, because you're going to be struggling to get tenure initially, if tenure still exists at that point. And in either case, you're going to be evaluated, and you have to show separation and independence from your advisor. By all means, collaborate with them, finish up the publications, and rely on that person, if you have a good relationship, as a mentor, but separate yourself from the collaboration until you've established yourself, and then come back to that person. Selecting a research topic must be research that's not been done before and is significant. It doesn't mean the subject hasn't been touched on before. It means when we talk about the literature research a little bit later, you can show exactly what the landscape of the topic is, and you can show that there's a gap here, and then you can explain exactly how you're going to try and bridge that gap. Think of that. When we say hasn't been done before, we mean that. It doesn't mean don't do anything on wind because people have done wind. You have to have a higher than probability of 0 that you can do it, right? They're not going to fund research that's simply undoable. No perpetual motion machines, for example, unless you really think you can do it, in which case, let's talk. It has to lend itself to a viable research plan. There has to be a path to get there. It has to be tricky too. It can't be simple. You have to have a research methodology tied to the knowledge gaps that you're going to identify. And you must have access to, or put in the budget, facilities to accomplish the research. If I were to put in a proposal to use an earthquake shake table on a full-scale structure, and I say nothing about who has that shake table, because UF doesn't, or how I'm going to access it, I'm dead in the water, right? You have to show that you have access to the facilities you need, or you have to include it in your budget. And it should fit in your strategic career plan. This has to do, again, with what Dr. Peake said. You're kind of stuck with the funded research once you've got it. If you went after something because you thought it was low-hanging fruit, and then you decide it's not really your thing, guess what? You're still doing that for the next 3 years. So make sure you have a passion for what it is that you're asking money for. You can go to NSF and download the abstracts of every funded proposal that's ever been funded by your division or divisions, and it's all downloadable. So you can't read the whole proposal, but you can read the detailed abstract that you're required to write once you get funded. This means you can identify what are the current trends, what's been funded in the past, what's no longer being funded. You can get a sense of the landscape of what the trends are. You can even identify the potential reviewers and what the research are, right? NSF is going to go after people actively working in your field as tier number 1 for who might review your proposal, right? If I write a proposal on experimental wind research, they're not going to go to a guy who does earthquake stuff first. They're going to go to other wind guys. So I'm going to find out what those wind guys are doing and whether I'm beating them to the punch or what. Make sure you Get a really thorough evaluation of your on-campus resources, whether they're experimental facilities in mechanical engineering or electrical, whether you have very important outreach programs that already exist for broader participation. You want to tap into as many existing programs as possible to leverage funding, especially if there's an existing program at your university that NSF is funding. They love to show that their investment is paying off and multiplying, right? And of course, identify collaborators or complement your skills. We talked about that already a little bit. Necessary ingredients. The structure of a successful proposal must include motivation, introduction, in not layman's terms, but educated person that doesn't understand your field terms. Read that proposal in the link to get the sense of what I mean by that. You have to have a state-of-the-art review and a knowledge gap triage. This is exactly where my field stands. This is the history of it. This is where we are right now. This is what's missing. And that's going to be your anchor, your callback over and over again throughout the rest of the proposal. You're going to say, remember when I said in that section that we haven't done this yet? That's what I'm doing. You want to make sure the readers know exactly why you're doing task number 3. It's fulfilling the your gaps. It doesn't have to be hypothesis driven, but you certainly have to have goals, objectives, and tasks. Hypothesis driven is one example. The proposal that we put in the folder, it happens to be hypothesis driven. And each one of these things with hypothesis, goals, objectives, tasks, as frequently as you can. You say, I'm doing task number 3 because it fills knowledge gap number 4. And this is how. Include perceived challenges and alternative strategies as you go along. Again, the proposal we provided has this. You get to the end of explaining task number 3 is going to be X, Y, and Z. By the way, we might have problems with Y and Z. If we have problems with Y and Z, this is how we're going to address it. You have to have exit strategies because a lot of the tasks are going to be linked. And if you don't want it to be a series system that if this one thing fails, everything falls apart. You need to explain to them how that's not going to happen. Broader impacts, of course, are getting more and more emphasis. You're going to get more talk on that from Dr. Peake later. You have to have a timeline that's thoroughly and carefully thought out, a test matrix if you're doing experimental work. You'll be required to list past NSF awards to a certain degree. A lot of this information is contained in the grant proposal guideline that is already in the folder that we're sharing with you. Here is one example of a layout. This takes a little bit of time to digest, so I'm just going to give you the basic idea. This is a snapshot of the same proposal that we've put in your folder. This is the one that I wrote together with the Johns Hopkins fellow. And the color coding tells you how much time I'm spending explaining what is the hypothesis and the fundamental idea and the background and knowledge gaps and so on. So pay more attention to the order in which these things are coming, as opposed to how much red is there versus blue versus green, because that's going to change depending on what you're specifically doing. For example, the red, the background and knowledge gaps might take 2 good solid pages to get through, and it leaves you less green space to explain your research tasks. So if you use this as a guideline, do not copy and paste. It's more about the order in which and how things are linked together. Make it logical so the person who's reading, if I'm reading your proposal and I'm not a domain expert in your field, I still need to know exactly why you're doing what you're doing and in what order. Don't leave me hanging. End every section with an explanation as to what's coming next and why. All right. Additional stuff, you have to make sure you have at least a couple of nice graphics in there. We'll talk a little bit later about graphics, what to do and what not to do. You do have to be technical. You have to demonstrate your chops, but you have to avoid a lot of equations. And I think I say this a little bit later, but that proposal that we just looked at that was funded for $800,000 had 2 equations. That's it. It was the storytelling that won the award. And timeline and milestones. You have to show planning. You can't just throw something on there that says, I'll finish task number 1 by the end of year number 2. Yeah, it has to have a logical order. Technical narrative. This is kind of my really big, I'm not sure if this is what I focus on, technical versus narrative. You do need to have a balance of both. You need to lean towards the narrative and hope that your technical prowess is going to come through as a natural part of your training as a graduate student, as a PhD. If you know what you're doing, if you're getting a PhD from a good advisor, people will know, people will see your technical chops. This is how you get a champion, by balancing both. Pages and pages of impressive equations get you the one reviewer on your panel who's a domain expert, and you lose everybody else and you don't get funded. Pages and pages of compelling storytelling. This is the problem. This is why it hasn't been solved yet. This is why it needs to get solved. These are the broader impacts. This is how I'm going to get there. To people who don't understand your area, you do that, you win the proposal. If you don't show any technical chops, of course, you're done. But just rely on your training. It will come through in your storytelling. So your job is twofold. Convince the domain expert reviewers that you know what you're doing. They then become your champions. They vouch for your expertise to the other panel members. If your literature review includes all the right people and the things you say make sense, you've now won over your technical reviewers. Then you've got to secure the non-experts as your champions. There's going to be more non-experts than experts on your panel, so they control the dollar signs. It steers the entire proposal construction process. You're talking to me. If you're not a wind person, you're talking to me in your proposal. You're talking to Dr. Peake in your proposal. Follow the guidelines, of course. We'll hit on this a little bit later. The PAPPG document, the rules of how to write an NSF document, what you have to do and what you can't do. All right. It's all about get to the point. Your big ideas need to be laid out crystal clear on page 1 for all the reviewers to understand. No equations, no jargon. Any acronyms that are necessary, you lay them out and spell them out. Here's the problem I'm addressing. Here's why it's important to solve. Here's how I'm going to get there. Here's a list of the potential broader impacts. So that everyone says, oh, I like where this is going. I want to see how this ends. Tell a compelling story. Don't write a murder mystery. Assume your panelists are reviewing 8 proposals, they will be, and they don't want to work hard to figure out what you're proposing. Right? This is like you're not writing a symphony where you can wait for the second movement to have your crescendo and your big dramatic moment. You're writing a pop song. Get to the chorus within 30 seconds. Get to the chorus, don't bore us, right away. The reader has only so much energy and attention span. When's the last time you read a dense 15-page document, had to digest everything, then you had to read 7 more, and then you had to speak fluently on all of those in 2 days? Be the person that does the favor to the reviewer. Make it easy. Clear and concise equals making friends with the reviewers. They want to fund somebody, they're gonna fund the person who speaks to them. Be clear and explicit. We're kind of reiterating here, don't make the reviewers work. What you write needs to be easy to understand. They're not domain experts, most of them. We're repeating for a reason, and it's in red for a reason. Compelling narrative beats technical savvy all day long, as long as you have the technical savvy in the background. By the end of the second page, they have to be hooked. They can be your champion or they can be your enemy. They're looking for a reason to put your proposal on the don't fund pile and move on to the next proposal. Don't give them that chance. Make it compelling. Keep your sentences short if you can, less than 25 words when possible. Keep your paragraphs to about 8 sentences when possible. Just the daunting task of when I flip a page on a proposal and the paragraph I'm about to read is a page and a half long, I have to take a deep breath and strap myself in. I don't want to have to do that. You need to labor, you need to work hard to write well, so your reviewers don't have to labor to understand what you're doing. If I have to read a sentence 5 times to understand it, that doesn't impress me. It means you're annoying and lazy as a writer. You're trying to overwhelm me with your authority. Don't try to impress me. As a reviewer, here's my own rule. I've reviewed lots of proposals. I will read a sentence twice if I have to. If I don't understand what they're saying by the end of the second time, that sentence doesn't exist, and I move on. That doesn't mean, if I'm not a domain expert, it doesn't mean I understand all the technical jargon, but if I understand what the point of the sentence is, why it's there, that's what I'm looking for. You probably heard of Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead. This resonates right now with what we're talking about. I didn't have time. I couldn't be bothered to write a clear, concise paragraph, so I wrote a long and technical one instead. You might as well throw your proposal right on the fire at that point. Avoid generic statements. The PI will recruit underrepresented minorities to her group. Instead, in the past 2 years, the PI has led the University of Florida's Women in Computing workshop and discussed how to create how to use virtual humans. Participant feedback was positive, yada, yada, yada. I am currently mentoring 5 underrepresented minority potential applicants. This has so much more power than just saying, oh, I'm going to get some underrepresented minorities. They're going to ask when they see that first example, well, how are you going to do that? Where are they going to come from? What programs are you tapping into? Lead them to water. This is how I'm going to do it. Every single detail you put in your proposal is going to be, and this is how, and this is how, and this is who I'm going to work with, and these are the facilities that I need. Connect the dots, reinforce connections throughout the text. Be repetitive if you have to, like I'm being for a reason, right? Literature review is your ticket to credibility. I'm looking at the clock right now. We're definitely going to go way past 4 o'clock, by the way. So hang in there if you can. You have to demonstrate a grasp of the history and current state of the art of your subject matter. You want to compartmentalize topics easily and by little subheadings, and end each section with a list of knowledge gaps. Here's where things are, and here's what's missing. I even make a point in my proposal to say knowledge gap number 1. I put KG1, KG2. It happens to be not my initials. I think that's just a coincidence, but knowledge gaps. Your tasks portion, we'll talk about, needs to reference those knowledge gaps. So they always know how your research is filling in the gap that they're convinced is there. Helps to play a little bit of politics. We talked about this already a little bit. You need to reference the work from people you think will likely be on your panel. Or people, if you were the PO, you would put X, Y, and Z on your panel. Make sure their work shows up on your reference list. Don't offend people. Reference relevant educational and outreach literature. It can't all be just engineering technical stuff. A thorough review should be 75 to 150 references. Doesn't mean they all have to get included in your proposal. What you should be including is recent papers that define the state of the art within the last 2 years if possible, seminal and foundational works so you know where things started, summary works, big picture stuff, successes in other fields that conceptually overlap but are different in context, modern educational advances, pedagogy, we just talked about that, include educational literature. You need to use this literature review to construct a landscape that clearly shows where the field needs to go and why you're the person to get there. You understand the path, you see the gaps. What does your idea connect with, right? You're going to say the 10 big ideas that we discussed earlier. My idea fits in big idea number 3, and here's how. It fills in the knowledge gaps 3, 4, and 5 I just talked about, and here's how. Research design. A typical but not the only research design structure that is successful. This one follows very similar to the example proposal that you've got. You need to establish the motivation, the knowledge gaps, the broader impacts right up front, hook your audience, your non-technical audience. Then you explain the hypotheses designed to explore those knowledge gaps. Then you lay out several objectives designed to investigate those hypotheses. Then you have several research tasks for each one of those objectives that get us to achieving the objective. Whenever possible, weave in the broader impact activities if possible. Some of the objectives or tasks might be created to service the educational or outreach components of your work. Don't have, I'm just doing research, oh, and then I'll talk about education. Try to make them thread together as best you can. It's not always easy. It takes work. And insert assessment mechanisms. We'll talk more about that a little bit. You need to show them that you're willing to evaluate what you're doing as you go through your 3, 4, 5-year grant to make changes if necessary. How do you know whether you're being successful or if you're just plodding along with your blinders on? More research design material. Every research task that you list needs to be tied to a knowledge gap you highlighted in the literature section. Make it impossible for them to not know what the heck you're trying to link your task to. Acknowledge potential challenges. We talked about this already. Every one of your tasks should end with an actual subheading that says anticipated challenges. And then you discuss, well, this might fail for the following reasons. And if it does, I'm going to do this instead. And this is why it will or will not impact the other tasks that are related to it. The reviewer needs to know that this is risky and it might not work. And you know that. Those are the kind of people they want to fund. If your research looks easy, all you have to do is connect, A, B, C, D, E, keep counting until you get to Z. They don't care. There's no risk involved. What's the point of NSF funding that? It's okay to say this might not work. It's better to say this might not work, and here's my plan B. Include an assessment plan. We just talked about that. How do you measure your success regularly throughout the project? How do you figure out when a course correction is needed? Doesn't have to be detailed, doesn't have to be a 3-page long explanation, Just allude to the fact that you're going to have these assessments. Be clear how the research tasks inform or rely on each other. Is your sequence of tasks a series or a parallel system? It's usually some combination of both. Make it obvious to the reviewer that that's the case, because you don't want, one of the easiest ways for a reviewer to reject a proposal is to say, task 3, I don't quite get. If task 3 isn't accomplished, tasks 4 and 5 are impossible. I don't think you can do task 3, so I'm going to reject this proposal. Consider a graphic that shows how tasks sequence and overlap, and of course their dependencies. So a graphic as well as explanations. Oops, I don't know why this one is blank. Oh, that's why. Convince the expert that you know the material deeply and the non-expert that they should care. You want to educate your audience, but you don't want to go remedial. You don't have to stop down and explain what a Fourier transform is or what a power spectrum is, for example, but it should be clear from the context what it's for. Scope is important. So you could suffer from too wide of a scope. Oftentimes proposals get rejected because there's too many things going on. It appears diffuse or unfocused. You're over-promising, under-delivering, or it could be too narrow. You're not offering to do enough. This is the kind of thing it's good to get feedback from your senior peers, your colleagues at the university you're going to be working with. Here's some flaws, common flaws. You proposed a problem that's mostly solved already. NSF funds the journey, not the solution. If you put so many equations that it looks like, hey, this guy's already got this all sewn up, right? You've got 90% of the work's already done. It may sound to you like that's a good deal. For the NSF, no, they don't want a guaranteed outcome. They want to see the risks. Poorly defined, too broad or narrow focus, insufficient explanation of the significance of the proposed work. You have to answer the so what. Now, I have nothing to do with the health field, but if I wrote a proposal that was all about manipulating a certain genome, and I never bother to say, oh, by the way, if I do that, it helps in the treatment of cancer, I missed the boat. Right? Don't be so focused on your expertise and expect everyone else knows what your expertise is and what it means. Tell them right up front. This will help solve the following problem from a human standpoint. If you lack a theoretical framework, experimentalists especially listen up for this. You can't just say, I'm going to do experiments for the sake of doing experiments. Experiments have to be a means to an end to solving the problem. If you have a weak or unsound methodology, I'm going to even go faster through these slides to make sure we don't stay here all day, because I know you guys can read these on your own. But you want to make it as bulletproof as possible. Can a reviewer who's paying attention poke obvious holes in your plan? If so, better rewrite something. A narrative that ignores or diminishes the importance of prior related work, that just goes back to not doing a proper literature research and making sure people know you understand you're standing on the previous generation's shoulders of accomplishments. Being overly optimistic, we talked about this before, that if I build it, they will come dilemma, that never happens. If you're provincial, you're solving a problem and you don't realize it's a global problem instead of just a problem within your own little field, right? Understand the larger landscape. Overlooking minor but critical details. For example, sample size, bias control, handling uncertainties, limitations of instrumentation. If you don't demonstrate that you know that a certain instrument in a wind tunnel only has a cone of acceptance of a certain number of degrees, excuse me, maybe a problem for you. You don't have a timeline, milestones, a plan. You just have a bunch of ideas that are loosely knitted together. That won't fly. Stylistic pointers. You notice there's 3 different ways of emphasizing stuff in the same sentence. Isn't that irritating? Don't overuse various forms of emphasis. It gets very annoying. Let the reader decide what his focus should be drawn to. Avoid empty calorie phrases. It should be noted that the phrase, it should be noted that, is never necessary and implies that other sentences need not be noted, right? You write it should be noted that because you can't think of anything else to say. When you write a sentence, dwell on that sentence. Take out every word that's not necessary. If a sentence reads just as clearly with 15 words instead of 20, give them the 15-word version. You're not going to impress people by being verbose. Don't copy and paste from a collection of your past writings, because then it looks disjointed from one paragraph to the next stylistically. Make sure you smooth it through. I've seen proposals where it looked like it was written by 5 different people who never talked, and it didn't look very good. Gender neutral language is obviously very important. We shouldn't have to give you examples of that, but don't say poor people, say people living in poverty. That's not a gender neutral, but you know what I'm saying. Dr. Peake included a good resource for inclusive and bias-free language, so please follow that. People are going to be looking more and more at that kind of thing. More stylistic pointers. You're going to be if you do your job right, you're just going to be hunting for space. You've got a 15-page limit. Once you throw everything down on the page and refine it, and it's absolutely as short as it possibly can be, it should be 17 or 18 pages. Then you got to go hunting for space. Start with, don't double space between the ends of sentences. You don't need to. It's a relic of typesetting. Avoid intensifiers, truly, very. It detracts from the scientific voice. Avoid colloquial language. Tornadoes don't slam into houses unless you're writing a movie script, not a technical document. We've talked about jargon and heavy use of acronyms. Define every acronym. A little bit about budgets. There's more pointers later on in the presentation. Talk to your PO about appropriate upper limits. In some cases, like the career award, it's spelled out very clearly. This is exactly how much your budget should be. Don't go over. Other proposals, like the at-large ones, like the one that you have an example of, there's no particular upper limit. So we just put down what we thought we needed to get the work done. We made sure the budget was realistic, and the reviewers said, fine, here's your 800 grand. Sometimes it helps to find out, depending on what time of year it is, your program officer may have access to a little bit of funds or a lot of funds. I once got a 1-year, $150,000 grant funded because the program officer only had $200,000 left. And my proposal was good enough, and I submitted it at the right time. I only knew that because I talked to her in advance. Right? Rule number 1, do not under-resource your work. Panelists want to know you have what you need to succeed. They're not there to save NSF money. The reviewer is not there to count pennies. They're matching what you're proposing to the resources necessary to do it. A budget that's too small will kill a proposal. A budget that's too big can be negotiated down. Super secret pro tip. I learned that the hard way, right? Joy Pashki can come to me and say, I want to fund it, but I only have this much money. Can you refine your scope so I can fund it? And of course I said, yes, I can. Get with your own grants officer. This is important at your own university. NSF has its rules and your university has its own rules about certain things, and they don't always match. So whether you can buy a computer using NSF funds doesn't matter what NSF says. It matters what your university says. Budget rule number 2, get specific with every aspect of the budget that you can. For example, anyone can just ballpark a travel budget. Don't do this. I need about $5,000 because I got to go to some conference sometime. No. I know in May 2022, when I wrote the proposal that's in the example folder, I was going to go to the Americas Conference in Wind Engineering, and it was in Lubbock, Texas, and it was May of 2022. I knew I was going to bring one PhD student, so I found out what the airfare was. I found out what the hotel rates were. I know what the university per diem rate was, and I came up with $3,187 as a budget item. That means I'm doing my homework. I'm being responsible. It reflects on my attention to detail, and it reflects back on your ability to do the research. You're not bound by those numbers. It didn't wind up costing me $3,187, but things are fairly fluid in an NSF budget. It's about the impression you're making, not about the precise cost. If you say you need a high-speed camera, don't say I need about $20,000 for a high-speed camera. This is the camera I need today. This is the price out the door. It's within the penny. This is what I'm going to put in the budget. Anyone can be Mr. Ballpark. One of the ways of setting yourself apart from the others is in the budget justification and the specific numbers you come up with, knowing you get a pass if it winds up not being accurate. All right. I'm tired of hearing myself talk, thank goodness. So Dr. Peake is going to take over and talk about broader impacts.
Thank you very much. And I did just want to say, I'm so sorry, but I have to drop off here at 15 minutes after.
Oh,
so
goodness.
I have 10 more minutes, so we'll get there. But I'm just
go.
So broader impacts, in the past, sometimes it was like intellectual merit is everything. I think there has been a real shift over time where NSF on paper has always said intellectual merit and broader impacts are equally weighted. And over time, there was sort of this, oh, but intellectual merit is everything, broader impacts is here. I think there's a much more balancing between the two. So it is crucial that you understand both what is intellectual merit and how do you get there. Everything that Dr. Gurley just shared is so important, but also broader impact. So what might broader impacts consist of? They might consist of educational opportunities, outreach opportunities that involve communities, educational programs. They might involve broadening participation, diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations among historically marginalized and oppressed groups in STEM. They might also involve applied research outcomes and partnerships that actually improve lives or improve organizational functioning at a local, state, national, or even global scale. Might influence the future of infrastructure, both physical infrastructure as well as our social infrastructure, such as building social capital. And they also may entail discoveries that actually influence other fields. Next slide, please. And broader impacts, as I noted, they really have been growing in importance over the last 20 years. I know about 20 years ago when I was on my first panel, people took them mostly seriously, but they were really focused on intellectual merit. More recently, again, I've seen where they're being put on an even plane, and I think this is very important. Broader impacts are important for you as a scholar, but also a human being. They allow you to show connectivity of your research to people in the world and why your research matters. For example, one time I was listening to this amazing engineer present about work they were doing to retrofit hospitals. And I said, oh my God, this is going to save people's lives in an earthquake. That's the kind of broader impact you want to be able to, that story you want to be able to tell. And so get those technical details right, but don't lose sight of why your work matters and what you can do to amplify the effects. So make sure that in the broader impact section, as with the earlier sections of the proposal, cite peer-reviewed literature that helps to emphasize why your work matters. And for a career award, if you're going to go for that, career awards are tough to write because you have to have a deep integration between your research, outreach, and education. Having an assessment plan for the broader impacts to not just say like, I'm going to change the future of emergency management because of my work. Show the reviewers, show them how you're actually going to capture that transformation that you're trying to affect in emergency management or in building codes and standards through involving a rigorous assessment plan in your broader impacts as well. So yeah, that's like a second research study. But with that said, be realistic. Make sure that what you're trying to do, both in your intellectual merit and your broader impacts phase, that they're achievable, specific, deliverable, and also be realistic in terms of sometimes you read things that it's like, no, you're probably not going to teach structural mechanics to a first grader. And so make sure that you're keying your broader impacts to the right audience. And really do consult with your institution to look for successful examples of broader impacts and where you might have local or state or even federal level connections that could be leveraged. Next slide, please. It's important to note that broadening participation is related to but not the same as broader impacts. And so one of in NSF's strategic plan, again, know your funder, know the institution, is about advancing the capabilities around current and future challenges. And so NSF's goal really is about discovering, nurturing, helping with future STEM talent. So that's why they encourage putting students, funding early career faculties, and really building and training that diverse next direction. And so broadening participation, especially among historically underrepresented groups, matters. Next slide, please. And we talk about broadening participation, we might be talking about underrepresented groups. So that could be racial and ethnic minority groups in the United States. It might involve persons with disabilities, veterans, women in certain fields. but it also involved the institutions that have been historically underrepresented in terms of NSF funding. As Kurt said, if we're only funding MIT and Caltech, what does that matter? And so bringing in strong partnerships with community colleges, minority serving institutions, women's colleges, institutions that work with people with disabilities are all examples of where you might develop a really strong and transformative partnership. Geographic areas also matter too. NSF publishes where investigators are located, who they fund. And so oftentimes we know that rural areas are underserved. The 5 inhabited US territories are underserved. Tribal areas are underserved in the US. So think about geography too when you're thinking about potential collaborations and partnerships. So remember, broader impacts doesn't always isn't a complete equaling between the two. So not all broader impacts necessarily involve broadening participation, but all broadening participation does fall under that broader impacts umbrella. And so if you do focus on broadening participation, make sure that you're still addressing broader impacts really clearly in your proposal. And again, go back to your institution for support and guidance and leave plenty of time to get the proposal reviewed on this end of the spectrum too, because it matters. Next slide, please.
All right, so transitioning back to me, it looks like Dr. Peake is at her limit, so she's probably going to drop off when she needs to. So I'm gonna drive the rest of this home and take as much time as necessary. Obviously, we're over time. I'm gonna keep on going. It's being recorded. Access it as you will. But I'd like to thank personally Dr. Peake for participating. This is the first time I've worked with her directly like this, and it's really been a pleasure. So thanks so much. This maybe the first of many collaborations. All right. So some more pointers for success. Some of this material we weren't quite sure exactly where it felt landed in the structure of the presentation. So we just kind of started putting them in order that we thought made sense. So time management stuff. Any notion you have about how long it will take you to write a good, strong, technical 15-page document and summary page, multiply that by 2 as a starting point, because you are all accustomed to writing good technical reports, peer-reviewed publications, conference proceedings. You're all getting good at that. That is a different skill set than proposal writing. Proposal writing is a craft. It's not just a technical report. There's a lot of different boxes you have to check off, and I think you're starting to get a sense of that. So when you're planning to write that proposal and you think you can get 5 hours a week for 3 weeks, but you need 40 hours, multiply by 2 your 40 to 80, and then schedule from there. For example, the Career Award is due July 27th this year. You should have your first good draft ready, if you were writing this year, for internal reviews by colleagues by June 27th. So you can get feedback and iterate. Don't wait to the last minute, because it's very obvious, as someone who's reviewed lots of proposals, a half-hearted or rushed proposal is easy to spot. It makes the panelist's job easier, the reviewer's job easier. Oh, 1 for the no pile. There you go. Next, now only have 7 to review, right? So take your time, give yourself time to do it. And Robin, I know when Dr. Peake has to drop off, you might have to keep track of chat questions for me.
No problem.
In terms of getting help, ask your chair or your associate dean about internal review programs. For example, UF is very common among other universities. We have a whole structured program for helping young faculty write and get their career proposal reviewed before it actually gets sent out to NSF. Likely there'll be something similar at your university. Ask an experienced colleague or 2 or 3 for a critical review. Ideally 1 in your domain expertise area and 1 or more that are not. It's very important that you get both, because you got to convince that person that's not a domain expert. Give your draft to a non-scientist friend and ask if they can follow what you're trying to do and why. Forget about the equations. When I had my NSF grant, my second attempt at the Career Award was 1999. That's when it was funded. It was dramatically improved from the first one because I gave it to my wife, who isn't an engineer, but trust me, is much smarter than me. And she tore that thing apart from top to bottom, and it was more red than black. And it was so much better because she didn't give a darn about my equations. She cared about the storytelling, and it helped dramatically. Get someone you trust who is smart. That's all you need. Answer the mail. This is a slogan. It means follow the guidelines, including formatting requirements. How you get a proposal returned without review, which does happen, go over the page count by even one sentence. Incorrect formatting, you use the wrong font size, wrong margins. There's a bit of flexibility, but you can't go outside of what NSF defines as acceptable. Omit a section. For example, if you're going to fund a postdoc and you don't include a postdoc mentoring plan, they're not going to politely say, where's your mentoring plan? They're just going to reject your proposal. If you submit late by a millisecond, it's rejected without review. Assume that your university's internet connection is going to be frazzled and down a good week before the submission deadline, and get it submitted a week before it's due. I was a part of a large proposal with multiple universities, literally tens of faculty members putting hundreds of hours into a large proposal, and it got rejected because there was a glitch from the university that was going to fund it, that was going to submit it. They weren't able to submit it. It was submitted 1 minute late, and literally thousands of hours of work got returned without review. They are not forgiving. Follow the rules. Produce high quality figures. And it just means readable and understandable. Doesn't have to be really fancy graphics. And here's the rule that I like to follow. Plots, graphs, charts, tables, pictures. A picture is not worth 1,000 words. You have to tell them what words go with that figure. They do not speak for themselves. Don't include any graphics you're not willing to or able to discuss and explain in the text. If you just say see figure 1, and figure 1 has all sorts of notation and the axes aren't defined and you're using terms that aren't in your proposal, you might as well not have included figure number 1. Aim for concision. This is just practice. And I said this before. If your sentence can be said in 15 words instead of 20, do it in 15. The proposed research seeks to experimentally test how aerobic processes, blah, blah, blah. The proposed research will reveal how aerobic processes, right? Seeks to experimentally test can be interpreted lots of ways. You lack conviction. You've put in insufficient time to know whether it's going to work, and or conceptualize the experiment. You're focused on the process of just doing and not goal-oriented, right? This speaks to something I'll say a little bit later. Everything you leave to your reviewer's imagination to interpret what you're trying to say will not go your way. The objective of the research is to develop. Is that good? Or the research will develop? Which one is better? More words doesn't impress people. Clear, concise impresses people. Get right to the point. We will perform an analysis of factor X to characterize versus we will analyze factor X to characterize. I will present a comparison of versus compare. See what I mean? It takes, because I will present a comparison of looks perfectly fine when you write it down. There's nothing offensive about that, but think hard. Every sentence I write, I labor over. Every paragraph I write 2, 3, 4, 5 times until I've removed every word I possibly can. People will notice that effort. One of the questions you guys submitted, how do you make something stand out? No extra fatty language in the proposal. Every word has to be there. People notice that, and they know how much work it takes to get there. Erroneous words. You know, we all have these in our repertoire we have to get rid of. There's no such word as irregardless. Don't say that. Don't say a priori if you mean something else. There's a difference between contiguous, continual, and continuous. Farther versus further, meteor versus meteorite versus asteroid. Your reviewers are going to look for precision, right? They need to know you know what you're talking about. Avoid weasel words. Somewhat, improve understanding, a growing body of evidence without demonstrating what you mean. How to catch mistakes. I've finished my draft. As far as I'm concerned, I'm ready to submit this to NSF. What do I do next? Of course, I carefully read every word in the final document and see if there's any mistakes. Then I change the font, and I change the font size, because then it looks a little bit different, and I might catch something I didn't catch before. It doesn't matter if it's no longer 15 pages. You're going to recorrect that. Make it a PDF and review it again. Then reformat it to the final version. Print out a copy with a red pen and go over every word, reading it out loud to yourself. The problem you're going to come across is you've read and reread and wrote and rewrote this paragraph so many times, you're not really reading it anymore. you're reading what you think you mean. You're not really reading the words anymore. It's a hard trap to get out of. That's why you get to give it to a friend and go through this process. Ask a colleague for editorial review, or your spouse or your friend. Don't care about the technical language. Do you follow what I'm trying to say? And is this English making sense? All right. I've reviewed, as I said, part of my job at UF is to work with younger faculty to develop proposals. And I took a couple of dozen proposals that I've reviewed, and I always put comments in the margins as how I communicate with them. So I've pulled out 2 slides worth of the most common advice that I've given to real proposals written by real young faculty. So let's go through them a little bit. And remember, all these are within context of something specific they wrote. So it's not all going to make immediate sense, but you'll get it. I wrote, you're not going to aim to expedite and improve. You will expedite and improve. Keep the attitude throughout the whole proposal. Reviewers don't want humility and meekness. They want ambition, determination, confidence, concision, clarity, and a proposal that speaks to non-experts and the experts. They're not doing you a favor by giving you money. That cannot be your attitude. Your attitude has to be, this is a good idea. I'm the right person for it. Here it is. Take my word for it, and I'm going to prove myself, right? You're forming a partnership. You're dancing with your review committee, right? You've got to lead the dance. The NSF panelists tend to hate phrases like improve knowledge. It's so weaselly. It's non-committal. It's non-specific. It's vague. It can be said about any attempt to do anything. Getting a price check on deodorant at the grocery store is improving knowledge. So what? Replace it with something more specific than improving knowledge. You can't be timid about the potential impact of your proposed efforts. Make bold, realistic statements about what you're trying to achieve. Replace the general with the specific. Be aspirational. You will have room in the proposal to prove you have a realistic understanding of your possible problems. Like I said, you're going to have the potential issues section of your proposal, and then have your plan Bs. Once they see, if everything goes exactly right, I'm going to get from here to here. But if things go wrong along the way, I'm going to get at least this far. They know you're thinking. One more slide of these common comments. I put at the end of a section, this was not a very dramatic closing sentence and kind of landed with a thud. Make the reader say, wow, this really seems important. The end of your introduction and motivation sentence needs to end with, I really need to, I got to learn what this person's going to do next. Not just some esoteric little reference to something technical, right? End it with, and this will improve building codes and improve resilience of communities worldwide, if that's realistic. Try to bridge the gap between improving your work and improving the currently accepted methods. You don't want to be myopic. If I achieve the following attempt to improve stochastic simulation, it's going to help me simulate winds. And then talk about how it might help seismic and how it might make its way into health researchers that are modeling brainwaves and whatnot. Show that you have extensions to what you're trying to do. Vagueness invites, I've said this before, vagueness invites reviewers to make up their own interpretation of what you mean. It's usually a very bad thing. If your attitude is you've written a sentence, you've written it again, you've written it again, you've written the paragraph 2 or 3 times, it's still not crystal clear. So you say to yourself, I'm going to give up. They'll know what I mean. It never works. A reviewer only knows what you write down. They don't know what you mean. Leave it to the reviewer's interpretation at your own peril. And this is my favorite one. Holy cow, this sentence perfectly describes your idea and its significance in less than 20 words, and even I understand it. Why did you put it on page 4? This is the first sentence of your proposal. Now rewrite it. All right, Dr. Peake has AMS grade. So I'm going to keep on going through. We've got less than 10 slides left, so we're getting to the very end. Merit review criteria, intellectual. So the title is when the proposal is under review. What are they looking for, right? There's merit review for intellectual merit. We've talked about some of this before, so we're re-emphasizing the potential to advance the state of knowledge of your field. It's critical that you make a compelling and technically persuasive and cogent argument about why it will work, and that it will lead to new discoveries or create new pathways and transform the area of study. It's got to be original. It can't be incremental. That's a death blow. It must address a critical problem or barrier, and the burden is on you to communicate why it's a critical problem and how you're going to get around the barrier. right? We all tend to be myopic. I know certain things in wind engineering that if we could just solve this one problem, it's not obvious to anyone else but the 5 people that I work with, right? So I need to explain to everyone else why it's important. This is another list. You saw some definitions earlier that Dr. Peake presented about broader impacts, what counts as broader impacts. This is another list that is provided by NSF, in fact, for merit review criteria. So pay attention and go back and review this on your own. These are examples of what would count as broader impacts. Remember, you have to have a broader impact statement that it revolves around and helps to influence your research. It does not have to check all of these bullets. It has to check some of these bullets, right? Your broader impact statement doesn't have to be A, B, C, D, and E. It has to be A, B, and C, and A, B, and C have to be really well thought out, and you have to explain exactly how it's going to happen, and it has to be realistic. Questions that apply to both criteria. This is what reviewers are told to look for. What is the potential of the proposed activity to advance knowledge, to benefit society, right? The reviewers are told, will this benefit society and advance desired societal outcomes? To what extent does the proposed activity suggest and explore creative, original, potential transformative concepts? Is the plan, and in fact, when you get reviews back from the panel, often they have these as their heading, and then they give their response to these. Is the plan for carrying out the proposed activity well reasoned, well organized, based on a sound rationale? Does the plan incorporate a mechanism to assess success? You can see now why we've had 70 slides so far giving you all these ingredients, because this is what the reviewers are told to look for. How well qualified are the individuals? Do you have peer-reviewed literature on the subject? Are there adequate resources available to the PI? Do you have access to a wind tunnel or a shake table or a high-performance supercomputer, whatever it is you said you need, or did you budget for it? I'll have to beg your indulgence. Dr. Peake inserted this slide, and we never talked about it, so I don't really know exactly what it means. I have a sense of it, but I'm not going to step on her input. The idea is that I think generally intellectual merit is on a scale, broader impacts are on a scale. You want to be at the high end of both of those scales. If you have great intellectual merit but terrible broader impacts, it's a loser. Same thing, vice versa. You have to have pretty darn good of both to be a winner. Interpreting reviews, this is how they come back. Each of your reviewers rates your proposal as excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor. You need to have a collection of excellence and very goods to get funded. Those are the ones that rise to the top. Out of the 20 that are being considered, 2 or 3 or 4 are clearly the top. And then the program officer says, I've got money to fund 2, let's narrow it down. That's generally how it goes. And sometimes you're the third in line and the PO calls you and says, we couldn't quite fund you, but it's a great idea, submit it next time. And so you get that sort of feedback. The comments from the panelists are a key to both improving your proposal for next time and avoiding an unjustified spiral, a shame spiral. And what I mean by that is you need to critically evaluate the meaning of the comments. Do the work to separate the valuable comments from the not so much valuable. But someone might have written a comment and gave you a good instead of a very good because they just misunderstood something that you wrote. You always have to assume a disagreement between you, your perception, and the reviewer comes from your failure to communicate clearly in the proposal. Right? They just didn't get it usually means I didn't make it clear. Not always. Sometimes I spell out on page 1 exactly what this detail is, and then a reviewer misses it. That's okay, it happens. The other reviewers will say, no, he said that, it's on page 1. All right. You've seen the 10 to 20% statistic before. Failure is okay. It's going to happen. Your proposals are going to get rejected. It happens to everybody. Learn to grow from the no, take what's valuable and improve your game. No big deal. In fact, assistant professors, at least when we get evaluated at UF and for tenure and so on, we have to list not only the proposals that got funded, we also list the proposals that are currently in review, and we list the proposals that did not get funded. Having lots of proposals that didn't get funded means you're trying really hard. It doesn't mean you're bad at your job, right? So the more swings and misses, the better you learn how to calibrate how to hit the ball. Think of it that way. As long as you're taking steps every time to recalibrate. There's a reason the success rate is 10 to 20%. The secret is if you write a compelling narrative, if you tell the story to the non-experts, the odds go way up. Don't speak to the one person you know who's a wind expert on your panel. That'll come through loud and clear. Speak to the 4 people who need to be convinced that it's even a problem and that it's important and that it's transformative and it can make a difference and it has broader impacts. That's the audience. There was a question about resubmission. You may resubmit the same concept 1 year from the original date of submission, but it can't be the identical proposal. It can be the identical concept, but not the identical proposal. It helps to send a paragraph email to your program officer to test the waters. Like I would write to Joy Poshke and say, hey, that proposal that got rejected last year, this is how I've kind of pivoted. I really like to still pursue this idea, but I'm pivoting in the following ways based on the feedback. Do you think I should proceed? And she'll write back and say, yeah, that's a good idea. Go ahead and turn that around. Then I'll write a resubmission. That's how that works. You don't have to ask her permission, but you're asking for trouble because POs are supposed to be brutally frank. She might say, you know what? That idea just isn't going to fly. That's just not a priority for us. Great. She saved me 50 hours worth of work for writing a resubmission that won't get funded. She's doing me a favor. Make changes based on your previous reviews. But remember, you're never going to have the same panel twice. When you resubmit that proposal, you're not going to be speaking to the same 5 panelists. And so you can't say, I answered your question about this, this, and this. Just rewrite a proposal and make it better. You have to separate the wheat from the chaff. We talked about this previous slide. Ignore the comments that don't resonate with you. If there was a sticking point with reviewer 6 saying, I just don't get how you get from A to B, but you think you've done a good job of explaining it already, then leave it be. That reviewer is not going to be on your next panel. Doesn't matter. If reviewer A says, I see a big gap in your experimental plan and here it is, and you agree, make sure you fill that up, right? That's what the reviews are for. Oftentimes the idea is good. Most of the time your idea is good. The narrative needs more punch to sell it to the non-expert panelists. You didn't lead your dance partner is usually why you don't get funded. That's a good way to end because that's the end. So I don't know, we can certainly take people off of mute and take more questions. A good handful of you stuck around to the end, so thank you very much for your 90 minutes worth of patience. But I'm open for anything that I miss in the chat, Robin. I haven't been paying attention to the chat at all.
No, you did not. Y'all answered every single question.
Okay, so I invite any one of you guys to, see there I'm not using gender neutral language, right? Any of you people who want to speak up, take yourselves off of mute and ask me questions, I'm all ears.
I just want to say, as someone who has not submitted an NSF proposal, and I even have to present on some of the information you shared today, I learned a tremendous amount. So thank you so much for helping me fill in some gaps of my knowledge because I haven't written a proposal yet.
I'm glad to do it. And it's probably something that's worth noting to all of you because I think engineers and young faculty tend to be very modest people, not imposing people. That's been my experience, with maybe me as the exception. You have to recognize people my age, I'm in my early 50s, I've been doing this for 25 years. Nowadays, the best part of my job is when I can put the wind in the sails of a newer person. It's not bothering me when the junior faculty member says, I need some of your time to help make this better. I love putting time into that. And I know I'm not alone in that. So do not feel reticent about asking for help from the people next door. The worst they can say is, I don't have time for you. Right? If they're that kind of person, cross them off the list and find people that have time for you. But the way you're going to succeed is leaning on others who've been there before.
I think that's great advice.
All right. Well, next on my list of things to do at 5:30, my daughter's doing a production of Zombies versus something or other at the drama club. So that's.
I have one question.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Gurley, for this great presentation. I'm interested to know if through NSF, is there any funding available as an individual, or those who attempt to write a proposal should be part of a university or a company to be eligible to apply for a fund through proposal writing? Can individually anyone write a proposal and get funded?
So you'll want to search for NSF eligibility requirements. You don't have to be part of a university to get funded by NSF. You can be part of a private company. I do not know specifically about whether an individual, say a self-employed consultant, what it would take to get them qualified to receive funding. There has to be some sort of infrastructure in place for the administration of the grant. But I don't know exactly what that might look like. It's just not part of my experience. So the best I can say is maybe, but you can always, if you know what division you want to write to, that's a great thing to contact a PO and say, I'm so-and-so, my expertise is this, I'd like to write a proposal, but here's my circumstance. I'm self-employed. What do I need to do to be eligible?
Thank you very much. Great.
Anyone else? All right. Well, I'll do the dangerous thing and offer you guys to get in touch with me individually via email if you wish to follow up with anything. You know my name, you know where I'm at. I'm easy to find, so feel free to reach out. And we have, maybe I'll let the cat out of the bag, Robin. We were talking about, now that you've had the 101, the basic course on writing grants, Dr. Peake and I and Robin have started talking about a follow-up where it's going to be a lot more interactive. You guys get some homework and you're going to write me a one-page summary of your idea and its broader impacts and its intellectual merit. And we'll have an evaluation process, kind of give you a little bit of practice. So that's nothing on the books yet, but I think that would be a good thing to do next. So you guys can start practicing before it really costs you too much time and effort.
Yeah, it looks like I did discuss it shortly with Lori when you went to check your kitchen, and she said July is off the books because of the natural hazards workshop.
Yeah.
And I know that totally sucks up her July. So maybe we're shooting for August if we can come up with a date. But we would love for y'all to participate and get that one-on-one feedback from these experts.
Yeah, and we don't know whether it be a workshop where small groups of people come in and read each other's and critique, or whether it's just going to be one-on-one meetings. I prefer the former because it would be good for you folks to read each other's statements to start getting a sense of how do I evaluate someone else's ideas? What's resonating with me, what's not? Instead of just getting my take on everything, let's get a handful of takes on things. It's a germ of an idea, but that's the direction I think we'll go, is maybe small groups of 5 or 6 or 7 people at a time exchanging project ideas in a formal written way, and then having an evaluation and a talk about it. All right, well, I don't want to hold you guys anymore. Gosh, it's Friday and it's almost 5 o'clock. So feel free to go ahead and sign off at your leisure. It's actually up to Robin to make a motion for dismissal, I suppose.
Jasmine, do you have any final words to wrap up?
I don't think so, really. I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Gurley, and also Dr. Peake, for doing this, because this is definitely something that I wanted. I'm very interested in, and I'm really happy that we were able to put it on, and also that we were able to have so much information put into it.
I'm sorry about that, but I'm not sorry about that.
Oh, I think it was great. I think it was all things that I needed to hear. So as far as what I'm interested in doing.
All right, everyone. Well, I'm off to drama club.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Enjoy drama.
Thank you.